It's about a 20-minute presentation, and then I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. And today is World Duchenne Awareness Day, so I'm very pleased to be talking to you on what is a very important day for our community. Next slide, please. So this isn't really the life I imagined for myself. I used to be a correspondent and presenter for Channel 4 News and CNN International, and then one day out of the blue, my eldest son, my precious son Eli, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I'd never heard of this disease, and the cruelty of it when it was explained to me was just devastating. The doctors told me my son would be in a wheelchair by the age of 8 or 9, he'd be completely paralyzed by his early teens in what should be the prime of his life, and that life expectancy was early 20s, and there was really nothing they could do. And in that moment, you know, I wish the doctors had given me some sort of diagnosis as well. I wish they had said to me, Emily, your son has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and your world is collapsing condition or relapsing, remitting grief disorder. You know, just something, anything to see me through those first days, weeks and months. You know, I wish they had given me this, said to me, Emily, you know, this is going to be a journey for you, and you are somehow going to have to find the strength to give your son the best life possible and hold his hand whilst he slowly slips towards death. And it took my husband and I many, many long months to bring ourselves out of that pit of despair, and then decide to do something. You know, we did have a choice in that moment of diagnosis. We had a choice to accept the disease and what it would do, or to fight it. And our decision in that moment was to fight it. Next slide, please. And I had the fortune, very good fortune, of meeting another mum, Alex Johnson, whose son Jack had also recently been diagnosed. She set up a charity called Joining Jack. We set up Duchenne Children's Trust. Next slide, please. And then in 2016, we combined forces to create Duchenne UK. Next slide, please. What started off as a very lonely journey has now evolved into something, you know, akin to a movement of families who are backing Alex and I in our mission to fund treatments and improve the quality of lives of boys, young men, and increasingly adults now living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I think the power of a patient organization, and why I talked about the title in this speech today about trying to create a paradigm shift, is that we as the patients are living Duchenne on the front line. You know, we're living, breathing it as caregivers through the eyes of our sons. And we're coming up against the challenges and the pitfalls that exist in drug development in a real time, very real, on the ground way. And what we've been able to do, I think, is to leverage that insight as patients, combined with the money that we've raised, to really try and make a difference. In 10 years, we've spent over £16 million on clinical research, and I'll explain a couple of the programs that we're running shortly. That's obviously a drop in the ocean in pharmaceutical terms, but I feel like we have used our patient knowledge and that money to really tackle some of the challenges and help smooth the path of drug development. Next slide, please. So really, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this breakdown of the research timeline, if you like, the basic science, the preclinical, the clinical trials, supporting those trials and regulatory approval, and then the final hurdle is approval and access. And all across this pathway, Duchenne UK has tried to add value and add impact. We do fund basic research, but our main focus is bridging that valley of death from lab to bedside and trying to encourage promising treatments out of the laboratory and into the clinic where they can be tested on patients. Next slide, please. So two of the things we're most proud of, we've seed funded a company called Solid Biosciences who were looking to develop treatments for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we took to them an idea of developing gene therapy. And the CEO, Ilan Ganot, really worked unbelievably hard to bring this to reality. Us, along with the Duchenne Research Fund and Joining Jack, invested $5 million in their gene therapy program. And this was something that the doctors had told me would never happen in my son's lifetime. When he was diagnosed, I desperately asked about gene therapy and they said this would not happen. But we're not very good at taking no for an answer. So we invested $5 million in Solid Biosciences. They were able to deliver solid preclinical data. And I'm really pleased to say that they are now in the clinic testing AAV microdystrophin microdystrophin on patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Not only is Solid doing this, but Sarepta are also running clinical trials, and Pfizer is now in a phase 3 study testing AAV microdystrophin, and they dosed their first patient in the UK earlier this year, which is really fantastic news. 2 other projects that we're very proud to support. Tamoxifen is a repurposed drug. It's a drug to treat breast cancer. And there was some data from the University of Geneva to suggest that it could be beneficial in boys with Duchenne. So we got together a consortium and we funded our own clinical trial, a phase 3 placebo-controlled randomized study in 9 countries in Europe. And we're hoping to get data from that at the end of the year. And we really felt that was a really key area for a patient organization to become involved in, because the advantage of repurposing medicines is that a lot is already known about their safety and toxicology profile. So you only really need to do 1 pivotal study to work out the safety and effectiveness of it in your particular target population. And this is something obviously that patients want. They want treatments and they want them now. And vamorolone is another example of where we used our money to help bridge that valley of death. Vamorolone is being developed as a synthetic steroid, an alternative to corticosteroids that has all of the benefits but none of the side effects, or fewer of the side effects. And we provided seed funding to fund the phase 1, which then enabled the company to achieve 6 million euros of funding from the EMA, from the European, from Horizon 2020, to fund the phase 2 study. And I'm very pleased to say that they recently announced very positive data from that study. So we really see our role as accelerating clinical research to bring the benefits to all patients. Next slide, please. However, I think the focus of this talk is really looking at how patient organizations can create a paradigm shift. How can they really engage with the infrastructure, bring the patient experience to the forefront, and therefore change the infrastructure and the ecosystem so that it can benefit patients and bring and expedite clinical trial development. So the DMD Hub came about through Alex and I's personal experience. We were desperate to get our sons onto clinical trials and discovered that they were actually turning away clinical trials in the UK because there weren't enough doctors and nurses to run them. Next slide, please. So the situation in the UK in 2014 was that there was Newcastle and Great Ormond Street, who were the 2 centres of excellence who were predominantly running clinical trials, but they were at capacity. And there were a few sites running natural history studies, but really didn't have the capacity to take on further clinical trials. Next slide, please. We held a big meeting, and Duchenne UK came up with a plan to create the DMD Hub in collaboration with our colleagues at Newcastle and Great Ormond Street Hospital to really create a network of viable clinical trial sites which companies would have trust and faith to take their clinical trials to, and that would be able to deliver for patients. So thanks to our investment, we now have 11 clinical trial sites in the UK running interventional clinical trials for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And the Hub not only works to help industry and clinicians, but also to help patients. Next slide, please. So for instance, the vamorolone study and the tamoxifen study I was talking about earlier, both recruited exceptionally quickly in the UK because we were able to use the Hub manager, who's based in Newcastle, to identify sites that had capacity and to channel those trials to those sites. So we managed to recruit in record time for both those trials in the UK. And the Hub also works to support patients. Next slide, please. As I'm sure you know, clinicaltrials.gov is really the main go-to platform for patients trying to find clinical trials, but it's often very difficult to navigate and very difficult for patients to get information that they need or can understand. So part of the DMD Hub is a patient-facing website with a clinical trial finder, which we curate. So it's updated in real time and curated by us to give patients the information they need. Next slide, please. So for instance, patients can search for trials according to their status, according to their child's mutation type, and according to the treatment type. And then we provide a Hub summary, which is a lay description of the what the trial is aiming to do, what the treatment is aiming to do, and where patients, which sites patients can approach to register their interests. Next slide, please. So I'm really pleased to say that as a result of the £4 million invested in the DMD Hub by Duchenne UK, we funded 30 posts, doctors, physios, clinical trial coordinators, consultants, and 250 more patients have been recruited onto clinical trials who otherwise wouldn't have been if it hadn't been for the hub. And finally, we've used a very innovative pump priming model, which I really would love to see taken up elsewhere, where Duchenne UK provided 100% of the funding for the post up front, and then gradually, as money from industry comes through, the post becomes self-funding. And we've reached a stage now where at Alderhay Children's Hospital and at Leeds General Hospital, we have posts that are now being funded by the trust, because the money that's come in from the pharmaceuticals is now paying for those posts. And I feel like this is a really encouraging model going forward. And we were pleased that the DMD Hub was used as a showcase by the NIHR in 2021 as an example of best practice for collaboration. Next slide, please. So a second example of how we really are trying to shift the paradigm is with a project known as Project HERCULES. And it's really designed to help us navigate this fourth hurdle in drug development, which, as I think many of us might agree, is the one to look out for when you're in this world. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a little story with you, which really was the catalyst for Project HERCULES. So Translarna is a medicine which now is known as ataluren, which was developed as a treatment for a subsection of boys with a particular type of mutation in DMD. And in 2014, it was given conditional marketing authorization by the EMA. However, it took nearly just over 2 years for NICE to make a decision on whether or not to fund Translarna and for the NHS to begin prescribing it. And the problem with this delay was that the label on the drug said that patients had to be over the age of 5 and still walking in order to be eligible for the drug, which is around the age of 11 or 12. And once they lost ambulation, they would no longer be able to take the drug. And we had patients in the UK whose sons were walking in July 2014, thinking, this is brilliant, my son's going to be able to access this treatment, only to see their son lose the ability to walk in this 2-year time frame and have that door of hope slammed shut in their face. And I realized in that moment that there's something far worse than having no approved treatment for your condition. And that is actually having a treatment that's been approved for use, that is safe and effective, but you can't access it because nobody has worked out how to pay for it. And this was a very sobering moment. And I had found myself standing outside the Department of Health with a placard, you know, pleading for Translarna to be reimbursed. My son's not eligible for Translarna, by the way, but I felt this was an important milestone for the community. And I was standing outside the Department of Health thinking, this is a waste of everyone's time, because number one, we're not talking to NICE actually in the language that they understand. NHS, you know, the Department of Health isn't the department we need to be shouting at anyway. And what they need is data. And it reminded me of a meeting I went to at the FDA where the regulators said to me, don't bring me a room full of crying mothers, bring me data. So I got back to the UK, I got some crying mothers in a room, and together we turned those tears into action. Next slide, please. And the reason we were able to do that was because of a wonderful woman called Fleur Chandler, who basically had discussions with me about drug development and the ecosystem. And the reason why I put this cartoon in is because we had both observed what had happened with Translarna. And we'd felt that what was happening there was really lip service to the idea that the patient experience can actually be really powerful. And we realized that, you know, as companies develop products, we really need to be a lot more sophisticated and not to just bring the patient voice in at the end of the process to plead for drugs, but to really capture their experience so that the value of those medicines and the information that we provide really does capture our experience and adds to that value-based argument. Next slide, please. So Fleur Chandler came to this story with a unique perspective. She had the head of the health economist, as she was at that time head of value outcomes for respiratory disease at GSK. But she had the heart of a Duchenne mum because her son Dom has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And she came to me and she said, look, there must be a better way of doing this. So we came up with an idea to try and bring about some element of collaboration to develop disease-specific evidence to improve the quality of submissions for HTA and hopefully lead to faster, more consistent decision making. We knew we couldn't do this on our own, so we brought in Josie Godfrey, who used to run the highly specialized technologies appraisal system at NICE, and had recently left to set up on her own. And we brought Josie in to be the strategic lead of Project Hercules, because even though then we didn't realize how big a job it was going to be, thank God we brought her in, because otherwise I don't think we could have got to where we did, end up getting to. Next slide, please. So really what Project Hercules was, the idea was to set up an international collaboration to develop tools and evidence to support health technology assessments and reimbursement decisions for new treatments for DMD. And I think one of the drivers of that for us was a realization that a lot of the companies in Duchenne, and not just in Duchenne, but in rare diseases, are very small, often one product companies, and they don't have huge departments. They are literally firefighting, trying to get their drug into the clinic, trying to get their clinical trials agreed, trying to get those clinical trials up and running. And all of a sudden they're presented with this requirement to present a dossier for HTA. And the way I sort of describe it to patients is that, in drug development, there are two mountains to climb. There's the first one where you have to gather the data to prove that your drug is safe and effective. And once you climb that mountain, there's a whole new mountain to climb where you have to prove that that drug provides value. And that requires a whole new level of data and information that can cost anywhere from £500,000 to £1 million to gather, and is overwhelming for these small companies to gather. So that's why we decided to launch Project Hercules, so that we could pool our expertise and our resources and our knowledge of patients and help these companies try to navigate these mountains and build a pathway up the mountains together. Next slide, please. So we launched Project Hercules. We were hopeful to get 2 or 3 industry partners, absolutely thrilled to get 9 partners who signed up. Sarepta, Pfizer, PTC, Catabasis, Santhera, Solid, Summit, Roche, and Wave. And we really were grateful to those organizations, because they really were taking a sort of leap of faith, if you like. Nothing like Project Hercules had ever been attempted before. And these are, effectively competing organizations. But I think what was attractive to them was the idea that this was a non-competitive space. What we wanted to do was to create disease level evidence that could be tailored to each particular product and each company's needs. And to create that disease level evidence that was really the very best it could be. Next slide, please. So we brought together not only our industry partners, but a huge global collaboration, because Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a rare disease and we need to engage globally if we are going to make impact. Next slide, please. So we worked with patient organizations in the US. We had NICE sitting on the steering group. We had University of Sheffield, University of Leicester, and we worked with patient organizations around the world to engage with those organizations who work in countries who have similar HTA setups that we have in the UK. Next slide, please. So what was the aim of Project Hercules? Well, the aim was to produce outputs that could be used in HTA assessments. So we did the biggest review of the largest set of clinical data, thanks to our friends at PPMD and CPATH, and we were able to analyze natural history data and create a new natural history model, along with discussions with parents about what was meaningful to them and what really happens in those monthly changes in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We really wanted to create a bottom-up disease model so that we could include those aspects that were important to patients. We interviewed hundreds of families to understand their quality of life, to develop a new quality of life metric, and we identified evidence gaps to commission a burden of illness study. And I just wanted to pause here to say that, having Duchenne UK leading this was really fundamental, because we really had such an iterative process with the patient community. We held workshops, we held advisory boards, we sent out surveys, questionnaires, and we were constantly in a loop with patients to make sure that what we were doing and what we were developing rang true to them and rang true to their experience. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what came out of Project Hercules, a new natural history model. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on this. It's a bit of a busy slide, but I think it's important because it really highlights the value of listening to patients to better understand the disease. So historically, the Duchenne natural history model was characterized into 4 stages, with some stratification in the late non-ambulatory stage. So it was really early ambulatory, late ambulatory, early non-ambulatory, and late non-ambulatory. And we discovered a new stage, a transfer stage, where patients are unable to get up from the floor, they are unable to walk, but they are able to stand independently. And before I go on to why that's important, I think it's important to just establish how we got to that. The published data alone wouldn't have helped us to identify this transfer stage. But by talking to patients, we were able to identify that this was a common theme amongst their experiences and how important it was for them in the disease progression. It emerged through the leadership of the patients in the core team, ensuring that the patient experience were given the same weight as published data in identifying what was important. And I think that's really key here. And it remained in the model despite concerns from some that the lack of data meant it should be removed because it couldn't be used for HTA. But we persisted with it there, though there's an option to remove it, and are now currently pursuing more data for this stage. And I think what's important about it is this is a really important stage for parents, because it's at this stage where patients can still maintain some level of independence. They can still transfer safely from their bed to their chair, from their chair to toileting, to showers, and to help get dressed and undressed. So it is a really important element for quality of life and for independence. But historically, it hadn't been captured. And we hope that it's going to be very useful in terms of incorporating it into HTA and making that value-based argument. Next slide, please. The next thing we did was a rapid review of the EQ5D, because I remember having a look at it and filling it out and feeling so unbelievably depressed that it didn't come anywhere close to identifying or capturing how Duchenne muscular dystrophy impact on my quality of life. So we partnered with SHAR at the University of Sheffield to develop our own disease-specific quality of life, and it's called the DMD Qual, and I'm really thrilled to say that it's now being licensed by Oxford University Innovations. It's the first condition-specific preference-based measure of health-related quality of life for people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And it's a 14-item questionnaire which patients can either fill out themselves, or we also have a proxy version. I'm thrilled to say that the Qual is already being used in DMD trials, and I really do hope that it will add a huge amount of value when trying to capture the impact of a treatment on quality of life. Next slide, please. So I'm coming to the end now, but just to say, we were awarded the Eurodis Black Pearl Award for patient and industry collaboration. And it wasn't just Duchenne UK who were recipients of that award, but it was all of our pharmaceutical partners. And I really hope that, you know, this has helped raise awareness of Project Hercules, and that this could be used as a model going forward for other disease areas. And I will explain why in the next slide, please, Lisa. I think what's fundamentally important about Hercules and what could lead to a paradigm shift in terms of smoothing out the pathway for HTA is the patient leadership. We were really putting patients at the heart of everything we did at Hercules to make sure that the outputs properly reflected patient experience, so that companies can embed these into their clinical trials early on, and we're not left in the situation where patients are asked to come to steering group meetings, HTA meetings at the last moment to plead for drugs and try and explain how awful it is to live with a condition like Duchenne. We really drove a bottom-up approach driven by patient experience. We tried to include as much as possible an international perspective. We brought in all stakeholders at all points along the development path, patients, key opinion leaders, NICE, NHS, to try and bring those people with us along the journey and make this as a collaborative approach as possible. And finally, to say that the standards, I think, are very high in Hercules because we were able to have the time to do things to a really high standard, and we had the buy-in of the patient community because of the involvement of Duchenne UK. So I really believe that Project Hercules offers a new paradigm for international patient-led collaboration that could be applied to other disease areas. And I think broken down simply, It means bringing stakeholders together to include companies, HTA, clinicians, to bring a disease level focus that will allow for collaboration, even amongst natural competitors, and that through collaboration, we ensure high standards. So I'm just going to finish with a thought that, from my personal perspective, and that's the last slide now, Lisa. Last month, I read an interview with a father, Thomas Harding, who watched his 14-year-old son cycle down a hill and get run over and killed by an oncoming lorry. And I just couldn't get this horrifying image out of my mind. And it just stayed with me for days and days. And I realized after a while that his story did have parallels with mine, in a way, because Duchenne is like watching that happen, but in very slow motion. I'm trying so hard to keep my son healthy and happy whilst knowing that he is heading to this inevitable disease progression. And I can't put the brakes on. And in the article, the father talked about how he managed the grief, how life grows up and continues around it. It's like someone's flung a huge boulder into his garden, and somehow a tree manages to plant roots and grow around it. And I think living with a son with Duchenne is like that. The grief and desperation is there, but somehow we accommodate it and somehow life goes on. But this is not okay, because by accommodating it, I think we diminish its devastating effect. We have to, in order to survive. To the outside world, we put on a brave face when all we want to do is break down. And I think that's why we need a compassionate, consistent, and world-class approach to measuring the effect of this disease, not the mask that parents put on to cope with it, but really to drill down into what this means on a daily basis. It's why people need to collaborate to gather the evidence, so that it's the best that it can possibly be, and so that patients who desperately need treatments can access them. Thank you all very much indeed for listening.
Emily, really amazing talk. I knew it will be. And thank you so much for sharing the personal perspective and amazingly interesting technical perspective of this work. And while you were talking, I was only wondering what a role model you set up for many other conditions where parents are desperate, but they haven't even started on the journey that you created, because even though you're working for the future, for this dream of bringing the solution for future generation of Duchenne children, you're providing a tremendous value for community, keeping them engaged, and for other diseases, because that kind of support, not being alone and actually feeling purposeful and seeing differences, seeing changes, seeing those products coming in development, thanks to you, thanks to your efforts. I've never seen anything like this through my career within HTA. And I've been following the progress in Duchenne pretty much, as I said, over the last 7 years, maybe. And it's mind-blowing what you've achieved. And I think the unfortunate part is I haven't heard of other patient organizations, especially pediatric organizations, starting on your path. So I think there's such a huge need for publicizing your journey, publicizing this kind of ability to gather forces and actually drive change. It's absolutely incredible. So thank you, and huge congratulations to you, to the community, to the strength that you have as a person and the people around you. So it's really, really touching. So we're opening the floor for questions. If you could turn your cameras on when you ask the question, it will be great. Or you can type your question into the chat if you cannot ask the question. Lisa, why don't you go first?
Oh, so Emily, thank you for that extraordinary talk. It leaves people with goosebumps listening to you. The first part of your talk, the first slide for me as well, really resonated in that when you're given this devastating diagnosis as a parent and you know that you're watching, as it were, the edge of the cliff approaching for your children, you're also going through a grieving process yourself. And you commented as well about how if somebody could have looked out for you as a parent and given you support, that at least would have given you some degree of expectation and sort of management and sort of idea of what the journey was going to be like. First of all, do you think that the hub that you've created, because you obviously focused more on the sort of clinical trials and the treatment options and how you've sort of more globalized and enabled collaborations with clinical trials, but do you have also sort of your own personal enlightenment story about how other parents have felt much more supported and helped through the process? That would be my first question. The second question is, in light of that fantastic new evidence that you've produced with the transfer component, where you've got the patients, the children going from ambulatory to non-ambulatory, and obviously that can happen quite quickly and at different phases, do you feel that the HTA and regulatory bodies are taking note of that new component that you've produced as evidence? And finally, is that being linked back into your clinical trials sort of Duchenne data hub? Because obviously if parents can search for their children not just on disease, mutation type and what the status of the trial is, but actually is it ambulatory, non-ambulatory, or even, and now with the transfer group, that might expedite trials to be done quicker if it's trying to capture that very unique phase when they're transitioning.
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind comments and for the questions. Yeah, I mean, I think, without meaning to sort of blow the trumpet of Duchenne UK, I think patients do feel a lot more supported. I think 2 reasons. Firstly, well, the drug development pipeline is now bursting with promise and opportunity, whereas it wasn't, 10, 11 years ago when my son was diagnosed. There were 2 drugs in the clinic and they were mutation specific, and that was it. Now we have upwards of 25 products in the clinic. Not only does Duchenne UK do the hub, but we've created a sort of file of facts that families are given at diagnosis. And I think, there is so much for them to get their teeth into now. And, I'm sure that their clinicians are giving them a much more hopeful message than they gave me, just because there are, some products now in pivotal studies, some have been approved, and, it is, we are in a very hopeful era. So I do think patients feel more supported, and I do think that there's so much more activity in the UK now than there ever has been. I think it's really encouraging. Yeah. Second question, slightly more difficult to answer, because drug development is so challenging, and companies. When I came into this, I was so unbelievably naive. And I just thought, well, we'll just fund research, we'll get a cure, and then we'll get the drugs. And Fleur, when I first met Fleur, she said to me, they're not going to pay for these drugs. And I was like, don't be so ridiculous. My son's got Duchenne, of course they're going to pay for these drugs. And then Translana happened, and it takes so many million hours, human hours, logistics to get a clinical trial up and running. And it takes many years before you dose that first patient. And whilst I would love to be able to say to you that all of the companies are now using the new natural history model and the HTA bodies have embraced it, I think it's just too soon for that, because we're only just recently publishing all of the outputs now. And one thing that's interesting about that transfer stage is, and what this came out through many of our workshops, is that in Duchenne, we get to see a clinician once every 6 months, and boys get a physio assessment once every 6 months. Often this transfer stage only lasts for 2 or 3 months and happens in between those clinic visits, so it's not picked up in the clinic. So I think the next piece of work we have to do with Hercules is to really push the learnings out there to the clinical community, and to our industry partners, not just in the access and reimbursement departments, but in the clinical trial design departments. And that is the next phase of our communications plan, if you like. And we're hoping to sponsor a big clinicians conference next year, where we can really host a symposium on Hercules, what the findings were, and how we can use this knowledge to make better clinical trials and better HTA decisions.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer. I mean, the 6 month thing you've just said highlights for me. I mean, my mum's got Parkinson's, and they also, see them every 6 months, sometimes every year. Because of COVID, it's been less frequent. But actually, the decline in a mobility in a Parkinson's patient can happen very quickly. And it's silly to think that why should you have to wait a 6 month, an arbitrary timeline? I mean, I realise this is not as severe as the sort of situation we're talking about with Duchenne, but it still analogizes the point that it ought to be perhaps parents should get a monthly recall or some sort of text thing by healthcare services that automatically allow them to get to see a clinician at the point when they know already they're starting to see changes, rather than waiting for some arbitrary sort of timeline. So even if clinical practice could be changed in that way, that would be a great step forward. But thank you so much for the inspirational work that you and your colleagues have done.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Francois?
Thank you very much, Emily. It was truly fascinating. I don't have any other words than to qualify what you just presented. Emily, I think the next probably the main issue with Duchenne, I might be wrong, but will be the gene therapy products. It is probably the gene therapy products, as I see it very naively, will be the potentially game changers in Duchenne and in the very, very near future. Probably 1, 2, 3 years, but the very near future. And I have I have a couple of questions. Can you, and you have rightly pointed out some issues with the HTA bodies, but eventually, from experience on very rare cases of gene therapy products which were approved, the final element which influenced, in fact, the HTA decision was the price of the technology. When the technology provided some health benefits at a kind of acceptable price, like in the case of spinal muscular atrophy, even if the technology was extremely expensive, the technology was approved. But on the other hand, when the company wanted, in the recent case of beta thalassemia, wanted to have a positive HTA recommendation in Europe because of very small health benefits and the very hefty price on the technology, the product was not recommended. And it was not recommended not only by NICE, but it was not recommended by Germany, and all the company were muddled in the pricing discussions and so on. But at the end, the gene therapy for beta thalassemia will not be available in Europe. So my question, Emily, is twofold. In the case of beta thalassemia, it was a mixture of very hefty price, but also very, very poor clinical development. So my question, Emily, in what sense can we influence companies, pharmaceutical companies, to come up with better designs, with, I would say, a better consistency between the regulatory decisions which authorize the product, but at the end, HTA which did not want to reimburse the products, and also how can we influence companies to come up with more reasonable price or more realistic prices for their technologies, particularly when they benefited from public funding to perform the clinical development. So do you have any ideas on these general issues, Emily?
Very good question, and yeah, a very good context that you provided there. And I think there is a huge amount of uncertainty about how we are going to afford to pay for these products. And the simple fact is that we will not have the longitudinal data that HTA bodies would ideally like to have in order to make a reimbursement decision. And I think that is a big challenge. I suppose I come at this from the perspective of understanding the complexities of gene therapy. And knowing just how complex and how expensive it is to develop these products. I mean, just to dose one patient in a clinical trial costs $1 million. That's just to dose one patient in a trial. So I would be very wary of saying that companies need to have realistic pricing. Yes, they do, but this is an extremely expensive product. It's going to be. And I think if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, I am realistic about the fact that, countries have limited health budget. If it was my son, if it was up to me, I would sell my house, I would do anything to get him that treatment. But we live in a society where budgets are limited. And I agree, we do have to work with industry to make these products affordable, but I think we also need to understand that they are very expensive. And I think it comes down to, what does society value? If society values health and promoting health, and we've all seen in the pandemic what happens to society when health is questioned, when health is threatened, societies can break down. How much does society value health? And in that case, if society values health, if we are promoting products that are going to extend the period of time in which you will be healthy, which is what I hope gene therapy will do for Duchenne, then I feel like that's how we have to look at it. It's not just beholden on the companies to reduce their price. It's helpful for them to be competitively priced, but it's also on us to say, how much do we value health? And try and have the debate within that perspective.
Thank you, Emily. This is once again one of those almost religious discussions where there is no answer, but endless questions which come to the same point of a philosophical underlying. But we have to keep working with this, because it's not just Duchenne, it's eternal question, so to speak. And life is unfair. If you see the supernormal profits of some internet companies, if you see how much money is being spent on space journeys, one treatment for a Duchenne kid is nothing. It's peanuts. And we built a society which has no budget. As a national society, I'm not saying somebody specifically needs to pay for it, but there is no pot from where this can come from. And many countries, they set up telethons to collect that million for the SMA child to give that injection. It's not the government, it's not that wealthy individual who can support that. So we really don't have a solution in the system, and we as a society need to come up with that solution. So John, your question.
Emily, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I mean, moving and inspiring. I wanted to ask you a more general question. I really liked your idea, and I'd like to expand on it, of having patients involved in HTA organizations very early. Can you just say a little bit more about how you see that? Because I'm in the oncology field, and it's interesting that I read recently, for example, one of the patient organizations in breast cancer is extremely upset by decisions that have been made by the FDA, mainly because actually they're approving drugs that don't work, that make a lot of money. And I was very pleased to see a patient organization challenging an HTA organization. And I wondered how you saw how that could move forward, that patients' organizations can get involved much earlier.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose when I, because I'm a history graduate, this wasn't an area that I knew anything about until my son was diagnosed, and then it was a very steep learning curve. But what struck me about the Translarna situation in the UK was that here was a drug that had taken 20 years to develop. Millions of pounds have been spent on it. And at the end of the day, the decision came down to one patient testimony. You know, and that, imagine if that patient had had a really bad day the day before and they had just said, oh, you know, I can't come. My son fell over, I can't come. You know, fortunately, the patient who gave the testimony was very erudite and could explain in very clear terms the devastating impact of Duchenne. Not all patients can do that. And it just seemed to me to be absurd that this system that's meant to be fair and equitable hinged on the testimony of one patient. one patient, one testimony. And so when I say I want the patient voice to be included early on, I mean I want it to be included in a way that the system will recognize. So the system is there, the system exists. NICE has methods and processes. Dossiers are expected to be submitted. And if we can embed that patient experience in those submissions, I think it will make it more powerful. You know, we are, as phase 2 of Project Hercules, we're looking at developing a caregiver burden instrument, the burden on the caregiver, because the burden on the caregiver is extraordinarily huge for most pediatric progressive conditions. And, you know, you know, the diagnosis is like a sort of cluster bomb that goes off. First of all, it's the initial devastation, and then it's, you know, it sort of keeps exploding, and it's the caregivers who are constantly trying to keep everyone together and keep the son's care on track. You know, a huge burden. And so we're developing something there too. And I think and that again comes from Fleur and I's experience as carers and as patients. If we can bring a caregiver quality of life instrument and bring that to the table, bring that to the argument, the big value argument about how much this drug is going to add value and bring value and help, then I think that's really important. That's what I mean by bringing the patients in early, is that we create the instruments that actually adequately reflect what the patient's going through. And in drug development, you know, speak to us, you know, when you're developing a drug, come to the patients and say, is this the sort of drug you want? Is this, you know, the outcome measure that we're going to use? Is this meaningful? Will this demonstrate efficacy? You know, what do you think of the target population? Are we addressing the unmet need in this community? You know, speak to us alongside the key opinion leaders, because the key opinion leaders are clinicians. They have a unique and invaluable perspective, but so do we, and we should be seen, you know, in parallel, I believe, not as a sort of afterthought, not as a sort of not sort of paying lip service to it. But I'm pleased to say that I think things are shifting. You know, today ABPI announced that they've got 8 patient advocates joining the board as part of a patient advisory council, and I'm one of them, which is really fantastic. You know, the MHRA has launched its ILAP, the Innovative Licensing Adaptive Pathway, and if you want to be eligible for that, you have to prove that you have engaged with patient organisations. So I think that's really critical. I think we have an opportunity here to make the UK once again a global leader in drug development and reimbursement and access. But there needs to be a concerted effort to get there.
Very good comment, Emily. And I think it's really important that you said that drug developers should talk to patient representatives, carers early on. And you won't believe how many briefing books we see at NICE where in the section patient engagement, you see the line, none happened, none took place. And the argument is, oh, all the compliance rules, and it's just so difficult to now get to patients because of all the payments. And this is ridiculous layers of bureaucracy where and this happens, this is the way science works. A lot of times it's triggered, oh, something happened in the lab, let me see if this thing works further, let me take it to another level. Is the curiosity of a researcher that takes one step after another to then realize that, hold on, the clinical community might not be interested, or patient community might not be interested. And it's really misalignment. So this engagement does not happen early enough, and if it happens, it might not be at the relevant level. So huge gap there across all diseases, actually. So And
I just had a thought, Lisa. I wonder, is there anything more that the publishing industry can do? Because supposing BMJ or some of the mainstream medical journals, or even specialist ones for rarer diseases, if they could have some sort of year in review sort of perspective or comment that comes through with a patient engagement category in it, so it's peer reviewed even, I mean, it's published, it's in the wider domain, so that academics can look at it and realise actually this is part of the process of HTA. This counts as towards the evidence. It isn't just done by patients behind the scene. It collates, if you like, something in the main literature, so that, for example, if there is the caregiver's experience is really important, if that component is put out there into the sort of published literature more, and people are aware of that and think, oh Christ, it's kind of obvious when you think about it, but I hadn't really considered it from that perspective. That being viewed by many hundreds or thousands or whatever, hundreds and thousands of people, maybe there's something there that could connect up with HTA and with patient organisations, so that the publishing industry, and they can be open access articles by default, so there's no issue with people not being able to see them. I think that might be quite a nice way in which we can educate through the academic fields as well. I don't know, just seems a shame that because there's a disconnect, in my opinion.
Lisa, that's a good idea, but let's not forget there are two sides to each coin, and
Sure.
a lot of times patient groups may do harm instead of good. And I think Emily might be familiar with that as well, because when there's a blinded force of just a desire without any understanding of science, any understanding of processes, NICE had a lot of these experiences, and I think maybe this is exactly what John was talking about. One of the reasons we have so many bad drugs approved is really push from patient community who say, I don't care, give me anything. And it's really, really difficult. Like everything we talk about clinical research, there is a right way to do it and there is not the right way to do it. So, and so we need to, I like the idea, but quality control is very important. And when it comes to patient voice, it's beyond difficult, because in science, at least you have some kind of parameters of what's in, what's out. And here you will be called names right away that you are suppressing free speech,
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting necessarily it being a patient lobbying opinion. I was suggesting, for example, the fact that, Emily's done research where she's shown that they've identified this transfer group, and that's a legitimate area that can be looked at by HTA. Now, that would be an example of where they've improved the evidence gap. Okay, now it may not have been done through a randomized controlled trial, but it sure as hell is an important area that is relevant. It's got patient and caregiver input, which is completely, important, unique, and also needs to be brought forward. Now, if something like that was in, a sort of more published domain, it can even have a disclaimer to say, okay, this doesn't have evidence in the form of RCT or certain things, but it has quality as far as these components are concerned. We just want to get some messages out there. I don't see a harm particularly in that, especially if there's all disclosures and everything. You see what I mean?
That's a very good point. So there's just one comment in the chat from Stella saying that quite a few tools are not suitable to really reflect what patients feel or
fair enough,
to collect their data. So I think Emily also referred to it, and I think this is really one of the achievements of Project Hercules, to try to step out from standardized tools in the Q5D and really develop disease-specific tools. And we have a lot of disease-specific tools in different areas, but in many areas, even disease-specific tools might not be good enough. But now we actually have another problem. More and more companies come over and say, we're doing our own tool. But then you say, hold on, there are already so many tools. Why are you doing your own tool? Any chance you can validate it? Because now this became a fashion of development of tools without clear indication where there is a need or there's no need. And I think what Project Hercules shows, what Duchenne community shows, how all stakeholders came together. And it's not one company said, okay, we're going to do and develop Duchenne, the Duchenne project.
It was the patients who said, you know, we critiqued the HQ5D from the perspective of Duchenne and found that it wasn't capturing what we needed. You're absolutely right, Lisa, and I think that is the power of collaboration, especially when you come to this very thorny area of reimbursement. You know, it's data you can trust, I hope will be the conclusion. You know, it's evidence you can trust because it's come from the patients.
Yeah, I just think, though, that the patient voice, you know, if, for example, a guideline document was to be written and published to show what the challenges and pitfalls are for developing tools independently, where people are maybe going off piste or whatever it might be, or where other complications haven't been taken into consideration. Again, that's an educational learning thing. You know, the complexity of how the HTA and drug development paradigm works along with the patient component. If that patient component is captured nonetheless in something that might be an academic article, not necessarily promoting any one drug, as you say, it's a collaborative effort that says, well, this is how we've improved a particular tool or a component that was previously missing because it didn't have a caregiver, you know, perspective on it. Personally, I only see that as a good thing. I mean, maybe that isn't for the peer review literature or academic literature, but it's a question of getting that particular information out there to an even wider audience than people who are just entrenched in, say, Duchenne sort of, you know, sort of clinical work or something. So it might be that, especially when we're talking about repurposing drugs, you know, because you might have other experiences of other disease areas that then can bring further those sort of ideas together. But anyway, it's good that there's been some new developments and progress. I think it's you know, maybe we have this talk in 3 or 4 or 5 years time and see what the changes are. It'll be amazing.
Mm-hmm. So interesting comment from Bernardo in the chat line, and we're out of time, but Francois, I thought you had your raised hand. If you have a last comment.
I just wanted to elaborate on what Lisa said. What is at the moment, she has a very good point. You've got the impression that patients at the moment are not at all involved in the peer review literature. It's very rare when you have a comment from a patient in the BMJ or New England or JAMA, and I think it would be extremely beneficial to have patients expressing themselves when some new studies are giving their evaluation, where new studies are published, because at the moment it's very rare, either in the HTA regulatory domain and peer review literature, that we have the views of the patients clearly expressed in these fora. So I think the comment made by Lisa was very interesting, and it would be beneficial as well.
Thank you so much, Francois. So thank you.
And again, thank you very much. I'm completely speechless. Emilie, I don't know how you managed to do that. I can tell you, with my doctorate in pharmacy, I would never have been able to do what you have achieved. Unbelievable. I'm speechless.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you.
So bravo, and thank you so much, Emily, for your time, for educating, for sharing this incredible experience, and what you do, not just for your son, but for many other sons, for the community, is priceless. So, and you stimulated extremely interesting discussion. So you should be very proud of yourself. So if you think you sound like history major, you're nothing close to it. So congratulations on your new degree. And welcome.
So much, thank you, everybody. Very interesting discussion. Thank you all so much.
Everyone, have a good evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you.